I'm Dr. Cath Watson, and today PD Insurance has asked me to talk to you about desexing your pet. So first of all, to clear up some terminology, for males, desexing we call castration, and it involves removing both testicles, but nothing else. It's generally very external surgery. For females, desexing is either referred to as a spay or more technically as an ovariohysterectomy, and that's because the surgery involves removing both ovaries and the uterus back to the cervix, but the cervix stays. So why should you consider desexing your pet? The biggest issue for most people is around population control. So if you have a male or a female that are intact, so still have their testicles and ovaries and uteruses, then obviously they're going to be primed to breed, and they're going to try and do that whenever they can. Particularly for males, they're more likely to go roaming in search of a female that's on heat, who's producing all the scent that often drives the males nuts. And if you've got a female, then obviously they can get pregnant, and they can do that in ways that you wouldn't probably imagine. So just having a female locked up in a kennel is not necessarily a barrier to being able to tie with a male and get pregnant. So number one is population control. And I say the other reason to consider is the reduction of certain diseases and cancers. So for males, things like enlarged prostates, which happen over time under the influence of testosterone. Obviously, if you don't have testicles, you don't have testosterone production, and therefore we don't get enlarged prostates that can lead to pooing problems and peeing problems. Obviously, without testicles, you also can't get things like testicular cancers. But there's also other cancers like perianal adenomas, which are little growths that occur around the anus. They also occur under the influence of testosterone, so no testicles means no perianal adenomas. For females, obviously by having no ovaries or uterus, we don't see ovarian or uterine cancers, but it also reduces the risk of cervical cancers and mammary cancers in particular. And I mentioned pyometra before, the infection in the uterus can't happen if there's no uterus there. One of the other good reasons for neutering is that actually it does extend their lives. They tend to live longer and healthier lives. That's because it reduces the risk of certain diseases, things like pyometra, so an infection in the uterus for females, and it also reduces the risk of a number of cancers. It can help reduce undesirable behaviours, and I want to say here, if you have a dog that's already aggressive, then neutering them is not necessarily going to reduce aggression, but it does tend to make some of those male behaviours, like the desire to go off and wander the neighbourhood in search of a female or peeing on things, definitely reduces those behaviours, and it certainly can help in some cases with training and some degrees of aggression. But like I say, don't think that just by neutering your dog you're going to remove all signs of aggression. It doesn't quite work that way. There are some reasons to consider not neutering. One of them is obviously if you want to breed from your dog, then you can't do that if they've been neutered, unless you have managed to collect for the males some semen in advance or prior to them being castrated, but basically once they're gone you can't get them back. There are some increased risks of some disease problems that you should be aware of. So the common one that everyone talks about is incontinence in female dogs. That does tend to, the risk of developing incontinence does tend to increase the earlier that a dog is spayed. Having said that, for large breed dogs, incontinence is a risk anyway, whether they are neutered or not. And the one thing I would say about incontinence is generally it's pretty easy to treat. It's not usually horrendously expensive. So in the scheme of preventable diseases that may have a slight increased risk, in my mind anyway, that's not really a big one. There are some dogs where there is an increased risk of cruciate ligament damage if they're neutered young. So there are some reasons to consider later neutering for some particular breeds of dog. Another thing to be aware of is prostate cancer and bladder cancer in male dogs. There is actually a small increase in these cancers in neutered males, which may not make a lot of sense. However, the big thing to understand is that overall for a population of dogs, their life is extended by neutering, not reduced. So while there is a small increase in some cancers in some dogs, overall the benefit is still a longer life for the vast majority of dogs. The other probably most common negative for neutering is that you'll notice that a lot of pets are more prone to gaining weight, and that's because actually by neutering it does tend to slow the metabolic rate, not having all those hormones floating around anymore. Again, this is a little bit like the incontinence thing. While incontinence is not necessarily preventable, it's easily treatable. With weight gain, it actually is still all about the food that we feed. So once your pet has been neutered, you actually get to feed them less. So there's some benefits in that it's not going to cost you as much to feed them as well. And the figure I would normally give people is you can usually get away with feeding around 30% less food once the animal's been neutered. So yes, they can gain weight, but again, we're in control of that, so you have some benefits there as well. As far as timing, when should you get your pet neutered? Well, there's a bunch of things that dictate this. First of all, if you've got a cat from a rescue organisation like the SPCA or one of the many cat rescue organisations out there, there's a pretty good chance they've already come neutered. So they may well have been done very early, and this is hugely focused around population control, because we know over time that while people will promise that they'll get round to getting them neutered, often they don't do it in time or don't recognise just how early a cat can get pregnant. So in some cases cats can be sexually active from around 4 months of age, which is pretty young, but we'll certainly start seeing litters from 6 months of age. So even one litter of cats is resulting usually in 4, 5, 6, maybe more kittens added to the cat population, of which we already have too many. So like I say, early age neutering really commonly done by rescue organisations, which is just to make sure that those animals that they're sending out into the world to lovely families don't accidentally get pregnant and start adding to too many cats and dogs out there. The other thing to consider, as I talked about with the potential disease problems there, like cruciate disease, is what breed and what size is your dog in particular. So understanding the risks. So small breed dogs, generally the risk of diseases, cancers, that sort of stuff is much lower. We don't tend to see the same issues over time. So usually around 6 months of age is still fine to be considering neutering those. For medium to large breed dogs, there is certainly some increases in risk of things like cruciate disease for particular breeds. And I would suggest if you've got a particular breed, you can usually look these things up online or go and talk to your vet. But delaying neutering until around 12 months of age or over 12 months of age is generally recommended. And for some giant breeds or specific breeds with specific problems, it may be recommended to actually wait 24 months before considering neutering them. On the flip side of that, we do know for things like mammary cancers in female dogs, the earlier you neuter them, the lower the risk. So that's why I think you need to have the conversation with your vet about what's the best time for your dog. I can give you general rules, but it is also what your local veterinary clinic is happy to recommend and happy to do.